fellow cyborgs! Today I want to read to you one of my fairy tales. So when I hit 2,000 subscribers, I put out a poll of how we were going to celebrate all of us being here on my channel, and the book review extravaganza week won out, but a lot of people were interested in hearing me speak in different voices and read my fairy tales aloud. So today I'm going to be reading one of them to you and hopefully having a couple voices in there as well. I don't have a physical copy of this story, it's just on a Word document on my computer, so I'm going to be just looking off and reading it. I hope that's not too awkward for you. If it is, just click away and listen to what I'm saying rather than staring at my face just reading at you. Today's story is called The Story of Simon and Arabella and a Fairy. Once upon a time, a little princess lived all alone in a large castle. She was alone except for her friends, the echoes, as well as the shadows, with whom she would play ball as long as they stood against a wall. In a small village not far from this castle lived a little boy who grew up hearing stories about her. Of course, there were many stories he heard before bed and many children whose favorites were different from his, but he remembered the story of the lone princess locked away in a castle best. This was because each time he heard the story, it always ended differently, as though the story was not yet finished, but adults thought endings the proper thing for a story to have. It always began so. Once there was a fairy who loved a king. Unfortunately, the king loved his wife, the queen, more than anything in the world. That is, until his daughter was born. This fairy could no longer bear to see the king look lovingly at someone other than herself. With a pain in her heart so great she almost cried out, she stole the infant princess and took her to an unknown castle. Though she grieved to see the king happy without her, the fairy did not want to see the king consumed with grief himself, so she cared for the girl. Every night, as the little princess dreamt, the fairy would appear and ask her if there was anything she wanted. The fairy godmother, as the princess called her, would ask her if she was happy, to which the princess always replied, yes. Though the fairy swore never to return the girl to her beloved father, she was content in knowing that she was no worse off being away from him. This is where the stories varied. Sometimes a giant attacked the castle and the princess fended him off with a slotted spoon before the fairy could arrive. Sometimes a valiant prince conquered obstacle courses set up by the fairy before he rescued the princess and married her. The latter ending was not one of his favorites, but the boy listened ardently nevertheless. As the boy grew into a man, he trained himself in sword fighting and magic and all the sorts of things he may need for his eventual journey to find the princess. One day was that day. He bade goodbye to all who would miss him and set off in the general direction all adults pointed to when they told the story of the little princess. There was something in his heart, a sureness, that carried him on in the right direction until one day he arrived. The little princess, too, had grown up into a beautiful young lady. Her beauty was only important because she was beautiful just like her mother. As she came to look more and more like her mother, the fairy grew to hate the nightly dream visits. They had become an awful burden when they once had been a necessary obligation. The princess never knew this, but only awoke every morning with a feeling of unease. This particular morning was no different. She awoke and dressed, then made her way to her favorite library to reflect upon the coming day over a book of philosophy before her morning tea. A large noise broke the comfortable silence. The princess had never heard it before, exactly, but it sounded like the words old chairs say when they are tired and you insist on sitting on them. The princess hid among her friends in the shadows and moved quietly to see what it was. The great oak doors at the front of the castle had been opened. In a stream of light stood a man, or so she guessed, for she had never seen a man, only read about them. In those books, some men were noble or kind or friendly. She nearly stepped out of the shadow, but then she remembered the others, those who were more animal than man, though they did not look so. She remained still. "Hello? Princess? Hello? Are you there?" called the man. "Princess, please don't be frightened. I've come to free you." Something in his voice told the princess that he was the first kind of man, and so she descended the staircase toward him. He looked upon her as she looked upon him, both curious and both without words. Finally, the princess said, "My name is Arabella, and I am a princess." "I'm Simon," he replied, "and I am a shop boy." Arabella was puzzled, for he did not look like a shop boy. He more closely resembled an adventurer. Arabella led him into a sitting room, and they talked about many things: her love of flowers, his knowledge of baking flowers, her knowledge about books, his desire to read them. The echoes were particularly friendly today, as they joined in the conversation as well, making it almost difficult to listen properly. Unexpectedly, a great noise pierced the conversation, that same loud creaking of the front doors. Simon and Arabella ran to see who it was, and there stood the fairy. "How dare you come here? What do you want?" The fairy angrily addressed Simon. "I have come to free Arabella," he said plainly. The fairy laughed, and then began mumbling words that Arabella had never heard before in all her studies of languages. Simon understood. The fairy was beginning a curse, but Simon was learned and spoke the words to shield himself from any magic. The fairy frowned. "You will never liberate the princess," she threatened. Simon reached back to take Arabella's hand, for she had to be frightened. All his hand met was air. He looked back and found Arabella to be gone. He turned back towards the fairy and found himself all alone in a large castle. The fairy had taken the princess back to her home in the nearby forest. She bound the girl to a chair and began to pace before the fireplace, muttering things to herself very agitatedly. At first, Simon's heart fell. He had been so close to rescuing Arabella from her solitude, but then his study of magic benefited him again. He began to follow the trail of magic the fairy had left behind her. The forest in which the fairy lived was no more enchanted than any other forests, but since all forests are enchanted, Simon got lost a few times and came across a few bears and foxes before he found the fairy's house. He hid behind a tree and thought of the ways he could free Arabella. Besides a short sword and a pouch full of healing herbs, Simon carried a long blue glass bottle on his belt. He grasped it in his hand triumphantly. This bottle would contain the being of any living thing that it was pointed at once it was uncorked. Simon carefully uncorked the bottle and hid it under a pile of leaves, it pointing to the front door of the fairy's house. He noiselessly climbed upon the roof and knocked upon the door. "Who is it?" called the fairy from inside. "It is Simon, the liberator of the Princess Arabella," he cried from the roof. In her rage, the fairy threw open her front door, a half-mumbled curse upon her lips. Then she was gone. Simon jumped down from the roof and firmly corked the bottle, promising to seal wax around it when he returned home, which he promptly did when he arrived. Simon then rushed into the house to free Arabella. She was very glad to see him, and told him so. He said the same to her. Hand in hand, so Arabella would not get lost, of course. They left the forest and made their way to Simon's village. When he arrived home, his parents were in the kitchen talking about normal sorts of things. They were happy to see Simon returned, but when they saw Arabella, they threw themselves on the floor and bowed. "Please excuse us, your majesty," his mother said shakily. "We did not expect your presence, your majesty." Simon was puzzled. Had Arabella been a queen, your majesty would have been the proper title to call her, but being a princess called for the title your highness. Simon explained to his parents that this was not the queen, but Arabella, the little princess from his bedtime stories. His parents got up from the floor. "She is a splitting image of Her Majesty the Queen," his father explained. Simon understood at once. The next day, he took Arabella home to the king and queen, who no longer had an heir to the throne. Their eyes brightened upon seeing Arabella, and they rushed to embrace her. Though she had no recollection of her parents, Arabella knew that they were kind and loved her, and so she embraced them as well. As a reward for returning their daughter to them, the king offered Simon an apprenticeship with the court sorcerer. He eagerly accepted and was led to what would be his new room in this new castle. Simon was excited for his apprenticeship, but something in him ached. Though it was unlikely that a princess would marry a shop boy, it was equally unlikely that a princess would marry the court sorcerer. Though they had met just a few days ago, he had known her since he was a little boy listening to bedtime stories. He loved her. Simon tried to shove away his feeling for Arabella, but could not, and so suffered in silence. During the next week, as Arabella was getting to know her parents, and they were getting to know her, she explained to them that, were she ever to love someone, that someone would be Simon, for he was as worthy as a lord and as courageous as a knight, and loved her, which was the important thing. Her parents consented, and her father agreed to speak with Simon. Simon was very nervous to have an audience with the king, so nervous that he tripped over himself twice on the way. The king did not quite know the way to approach the subject of his daughter and marriage, but after nearly an hour of conversation about nothing in particular, Simon guessed at the king's intentions and asked for Arabella's hand in marriage. So glad was the king that the young man was clever and had saved the king from further embarrassment, he heartily agreed without even pretending to doubt his worthiness, as most fathers do, regardless of their title being Mr. or His Majesty. And so Simon and Arabella were married. Simon became the court sorcerer and was respected by and helped many people. Arabella grew to be a great queen and was loved by and just to her subjects. They loved each other always, and so lived happily ever after. The end. So I hope you enjoyed that fairy tale. I wrote that probably about 4 years ago, and I'm quite proud of it, but I know that it's not the best. It doesn't send the best messages, perhaps, with having a princess needing to be rescued and having insta-love and stuff like that. It was fun to write, and it was fun to read, and I hope that you enjoyed it nevertheless. Thank you for watching. Please let me know in the comments down below what your favorite fairy tale is if you have one, and until next time, continue to be lovely. Just a quick thank you to all of my patrons who are supporting this channel on Patreon, including Raya F. Thank you for joining as one of my patrons. I hope you're having a lovely day, enjoying my videos, and reading some amazing books.